Welcome to the Cambridge Creatives Q&A with Jessica Koravos. I'm Ellie.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and we are the founders of Cambridge Creatives. We are a student-run creative collective and are curating a series of talks with world-renowned professionals in film, TV and theatre. So please follow our Facebook page to find out more about future events. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we will begin. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, please type them on the Q&A box, which should be somewhere down there, and not in the chat function, and we will read them out for you at the end. Bear with us if there are any technical difficulties, and let us know in the chat if there are any problems hearing or seeing us. Please enjoy the Q&A.
So just to give our guest speaker a little introduction, Jessica is the president at Andrew Lloyd Webber's production company, a really useful group, where she has worked for the past 7 years. The company produces many of the most well-received and adored musicals and plays, including The Phantom of the Opera, Jesus Christ Superstar, and School of Rock, as well as producing film adaptations, adapting their work for international productions, and releasing cast albums. We are honoured to have Jessica to give an insight into such a successful production company. So Jessica, we just want to start off with some questions about your early career. Do you remember when you knew that you wanted to work in the business side of the creative industry?
It was a complete fluke is the honest answer to that question. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I was at university. I did PPE. I thought maybe I'd like to be a lobbyist or a prime minister, something like that. But so I decided to do law, really just because I couldn't think of anything else to do. So I went to College of Law and applying for articles, as it was called then, training contracts as they're called now. I thought, well, I'll try to get into the political side of things by doing my training contract with a parliamentary agent law firm. And there are a few of those in London, and Role A parliamentary agents, for anyone who doesn't know, are law firms that are allowed to submit legislation, private bills, and amendments to legislation to Parliament, and they've been chartered since the 1700s, and no new ones have joined. So it's quite what I learned once I got my training contract at a law firm that's now called Bircham Dyson Bell, was then called Dyson Bell Martin, but it's a very, very stuffy. I mean, it was very hard to distinguish between the senior partners and the taxidermy, and there were a lot of both in that firm. And it was so I did that until which was actually great fun and very interesting, until I qualified, which was in 1997 or 8, and stayed there for another few years. But then it must have been 1997, because that's when Labour got in. Tony Blair's government came in, and they decided that they weren't going to have lobbyists anymore. They weren't going to get influenced by anybody. Anyone who wanted to do anything would just need to go meet them in the pub. And that sort of, a lot of what we did then stopped being really the business of legislation and started being kind of secondary legislation stuff like Transport and Works Act orders. And I spent a very interesting year in Glasgow doing things around Acts of Parliament to let the Scottish art collections be lent abroad. But from there, it was all guided railway systems and Crossrail. I actually worked on Crossrail when it got introduced as a bill in Parliament, and that was in 1996. So think about that, and it's still delayed now. But that was that. I then decided that when they tried to send me to Manchester for 2 years for a guided bus system, I said that I was going to change careers. I was moving, and I went to work for what was then the new thing that was happening was American law firms were all opening offices in London and paying twice what the British law firms were paying. And I actually am American, although I had been in England for my school and university, but I had uncles and things who had got me paralegal jobs when I was at law school, and one of those firms offered me a job, and I went, and that firm was called Home Roberts and Owen. It was a Denver-based law firm that did all the work for a guy called Philip Anschutz, who was a billionaire. I think he's still like the 14th richest man in America. But he was a big real estate developer, and he'd had the genius idea of, he knew that the telecoms was all going to get privatized, because it used to be that you had your BT here, and there you had what was called Bell in America. He thought it was going to get privatized. You could have your own telephone network. And he bought a big railway going into administration, and he built cables in the way leaves on the railway to get across America, and started Quest Communications. So the first non-public telephone company in America. And that then started a bunch of joint ventures in the UK and broadcast companies and things. And I worked on that, but I was a very junior member of the team there. And he had a hobby, which was trying to make ice hockey big in Europe or in England. And he wanted to make soccer big in America. And so he bought the wrong set of teams in both places and had a bunch of ice hockey teams. He started the thing called the London Knights ice hockey team in London. And because I was the junior person, I wanted to be working on all the IPOs and the big mergers and things, but instead I had to work on the London Knights ice hockey team for free, and got and I wasn't actually in the slightest bit interested in ice hockey. But what happened was that we ended up with 6 ice hockey teams, and then he wanted somewhere for them to play in London. So we bought half of what was then an arena in Canary Wharf called the Docklands Arena, but that was before there was even the Jubilee line to Canary Wharf. It was literally in the middle of nowhere in a bog on the Isle of Dogs. And so that's where the London Knights ice hockey team played. And then slowly concerts started to come there, and it started to be, a sort of spillover from things that couldn't book into Wembley Arena. And eventually he decided, and in the meantime, he had built a big arena in Los Angeles called the Staples Center, which really did regenerate the whole of downtown Los Angeles from being a place where only 5,000 people lived. And you would get arrested for walking there, because anybody who was out there walking was just up to no good in downtown Los Angeles then. So they built this new arena there. And then so that, which got him thinking London could use one of those. And so he put in a bid for, this was 2000, year 2000, put in a bid for the Millennium Dome. So Millennium Year was coming to a close. The government was trying to figure out what to do with the Millennium Dome. He thought, well, we'll build an arena in there, and that'll be great. And we'll get rid of this thing on the Isle of Dogs. And so we put in a bid. We lost the bid. And Nomura, Japanese electronics company, or bank, I guess, banking and electronics, won. So we shrugged our shoulders and thought, oh, well, went on with life. And then a few months later, we got a call saying Nomura had pulled out and we were now the preferred bidder. But what that meant was that we had to swing into action. But there was no one to swing into action because Phil Anschutz just had 6 ice hockey teams and me at the law firm here. There were some ice hockey professionals, but there was no team. There was no group of people that were capable of building an arena here, which is how I got into the entertainment business, because he had no choice but to make me his general counsel, even though I was actually only 29, I think, at the time. So I was the sort of third employee in for the project that then became the O2. So we did that, but as we were doing that, I became, instead of general counsel, I got promoted to chief operating officer. And after a while, we were building our building, but we had big competitors in the market who didn't want to put their acts in our building. They wanted to kill our building and keep putting things in Wembley and in Earl's Court, which was a thing that you guys might not remember because it got knocked down. So then I was asked to start a company to create content and to put shows together and tours together to make sure that the O2 always had shows in it and that we didn't have to rely on our competitors to book content in. So I became the managing director of AEG Live, which is still now the second biggest promoter in Europe. And that's how I got into the entertainment business. So that's not a very good answer. So the answer is I had no idea. It was a complete bungling fluke, and here I am.
That's good. I think that's definitely a good and encouraging story. It's not any, we've had a lot of people who have been sort of vigorously involved with theatre at that time of university, and I haven't done that. So it's quite good to know that.
I actually had no money at all in university, and so I was waitressing full time in university. I was a tequila slammer girl. That counts. That's quite dramatic.
Amazing. Great story.
Could you explain to us like your daily routine as your current job now?
Well,
before COVID.
My pre-COVID, I guess my routine was because so the Really Useful Group, Andrew Lloyd Webber's company, it has got several different activities. One is that we own 7 West End theatres, including the London Palladium and Theatre Royal Drury Lane, and the Her Majesty's, where Phantom of the Opera plays. And another is that we produce our own shows. So Andrew is still very much a working composer, and we recently produced School of Rock, adapted from the film, but with new music by him. And we're in the middle now of producing a new version of Cinderella with a book by Emerald Fennell, who she's done lots of things. She was the writer of Killing Eve, the second series of Killing Eve. It's quite a dark Cinderella, I should say. And she also plays the young Camilla Parker Bowles in The Crown. So that's our book writer, and it's the first time that Andrew's worked with a female collaborator. Book writer. We've had set designers and things, but that's what we're doing now. But then also we represent the rest of his catalog. So other producers all over the world produce their own versions of Phantom of the Opera, or co-produce with us Jesus Christ Superstar or Evita. And we basically had 30 productions running around the world when COVID hit. We're now down to 1 because the production in Seoul of Phantom of the Opera in South Korea never did shut, because the Koreans have got their shit sorted out and nobody else does.
So how have you adapted to this coronavirus world? I know that you had there was the shows must go on YouTube. Were you a part of that?
Yes, very much. That was an idea, and we were all in the theater world thinking the same thing, which is, how do we keep in touch with our, the millions of people who were disappointed by finding that they couldn't go and see the shows that they'd booked, and people who'd waited for months to get tickets to Hamilton and couldn't go. And so we all had the same thought process, which is, how do we give them something while we're closed? And those were all recordings that we already had, and that have been broadcast in the past for the most part. But so we just called YouTube and said, do you want to do this? They said yes, they did. But what we really were trying to do with it was raise money for, one of the things that's happened with COVID is that actors and musicians and creatives generally have been very disproportionately hard hit by it, partly because a lot of them caught it, because that they work in a very close quarters with each other, and a lot of people in my industry were very, very sick. And the other reason is because they're all technically self-employed. And even though somebody might have been playing a part in the Phantom of the Opera for 30 years, they're not an employee. The way that the HMRC has always dealt with actors has been, because you never know, a show can be bust in 3 weeks and you're on to the next thing. So they always are treated as self-employed, even if they happen to have been working, if they happen to have been in a hit and managed to stay working for the same show for a long time. So because of that, and the sort of, lots of younger people who didn't have the self-employed history to show the government to say, you should pay us because look what we earned last year. Because very often, the ensemble of big musicals is made up of people who are fresh out of drama school or dance school, and can't show that. So it's been financially extremely hard on actors and musicians, and disproportionately within that group hard on the people who there's always a big thing about, can anyone who isn't middle class or above afford to be an actor or a musician in the first place, because it's so hand to mouth and you never know when you're going to have work or not, and unless you have a real safety net, parental or otherwise, it's very difficult to have that life. And as an industry, we've spent years trying to find ways to bring people from lower income families into the industry, and that has had a real impact, a positive impact in particular on a lot of minority groups that have been able to join the industry in bigger numbers in recent years. But when you look now at who has said, I can't wait any longer, I'm going to have to go get a job in Tesco's, and who has gone back to stay with their parents and said, I'm okay, let me know when the show's opening again, it's basically all of the minority groups that can't weather it. And we're going to come back to find that we've lost a lot of the gains that we had made in that area, unfortunately.
What were some of the ways that you went about including more or making it more accessible to minority groups? Were there any particular projects?
Well, I mean, you have to, the real problem, it's a sort of funnel process, because ultimately, and the same goes for, women getting onto the boards of companies, or, or disabled people. Same goes for if you don't see, if people at education level, in education, aren't looking up the track and seeing the future version of themselves doing a job, they just don't feel like it could possibly be for them. And the fact that, for example, you might look at Phantom of the Opera as a person of color and go see it and think, well, I mean, it wouldn't happen now, but it would have happened 5 years ago. You might have gone and watched it and seen not a single person of color on the stage and thought, I guess, that's not for me. And a number of things have happened in terms of a concerted effort amongst producers to tell different stories and to tell, non-white stories more. And so we see shows like Motown and Dreamgirls and Ain't Too Proud, and those kinds of shows coming through, which have been hugely popular. And a few of those grow the base of actors available for other roles. And so it has suddenly then there's a group of people who will show up for an interview or for an audition for Phantom, with experience and, having got into the industry in some of those, more kind of, you would call kind of black shows. But having more of those black shows has meant we have more people that can go into the other. And same goes for some Asian shows. Miss Saigon had a huge impact on Southeast Asian actors who got in and then have gotten parts in other shows since then. And we had, for example, a Christine in Phantom of the Opera that had been the lead in Miss Saigon. But if Miss Saigon hadn't been on, she would never have, been a lead in a show, or she would never have thought to audition for. And so it's being really proactive about, like the Brit School for me is a great source, because they have because it's a free school. It means that people get trained there, but they haven't, had to come up with fees to get there in the first place. So very often we'll call the principal of the Brit School and say, who've you got? Send them in. And that seems to work. But it has to be active outreach to people to say, please come audition for Phantom of the Opera, rather than just putting out a casting call and saying, well, everyone's seeing it, that nobody turned up to the audition but the usual suspects. Is you have to go and kind of pluck the unusual suspects out of wherever they are.
You speak as if there's like a very big community of artists and producers and things like that. Do you have to build relationships with the artists that either toured with AEG or the troupes that perform in your theatres? And if so, do you have any favourite memories of working with the artists?
Well, to be honest, you know, when you're on the business side of it, you might go say hi as a sort of, you know, to show respect to the artist, but frankly, they're not particularly interested in talking to you. Why should they be? And it's not, you know, with touring, it's different between theater and live music. Live music, the shows that come through big arenas are very self-contained. They come, they play their show, they leave, and you sometimes have. We had things. I mean, one of the most amazing things I've seen was the residency of Prince at the O2, quite sort of 2008, I guess it was, 7, 8. But you know, he played 21 shows plus an after party every night till 3 a.m, and just an astonishing. He had a learnt roster of 250 songs, and you know, most, and he just mixed it up every night. And most artists will come with their set list. You know, they'll play 12 songs and they'll go. There aren't 250 songs that their band could break into at any moment, rehearsed and ready to go. But so that, I mean, that's very that was very unusual. I mean, there are people like, I mean, Beyonce is a good example. She's someone who, whenever she sees women in the room, which is unusual in the touring world, she makes a real point of coming and talking to you and asking your story and how you got there. And she's very encouraging. Remember that about her. In theater, it's different because people tend to cross disciplines a lot more. You know, a lot of the people who are executives or producers now started as actors. A lot of writers, you know, actors become writers or directors. And so that ecosystem is much more fluid, I would say.
That's really interesting. Do you have any favorite shows that your company has put on, or can you not side with one?
Well, let's see. If we're talking about Andrew shows, I mean, I would say there are some unknown, little known jewels that if you like his music, there is a sequel to the Phantom of the Opera called Love Never Dies, which was not on in the West End for very long and has had a bit of a checkered history, mostly because, well, I don't want to do a spoiler alert, but mostly because the plot takes a turn that people who are big fans of the Phantom and Christine don't like. And so, but in terms of the score, the music is just stupendous. I think it's his best work. And I actually think Cinderella is going to be right up there. I think having a new creative team around him that he hasn't worked with before, and just sort of mixing it up will be really good. So I mean, I like all of them. I do. I honestly just do. That's why I wanted the job.
Yeah, that's completely fair enough. I don't think I think that's the right sort of reason to go into something. Just to come back to Cinderella quickly, and how you said that the book writer was the first female writer that Andrew's worked with. Why do you think that's, you know, do you think that that's been like a long time coming, or do you think there's been a certain movement that's provoked that?
I think certainly there are more female writers around. I mean, when he started in the 70s, he would have been very hard pressed to find a female lyricist anywhere, you know, or book writer. And it's not the kind of thing, it's such a symbiotic relationship between a book, you know, a composer and a lyricist, or a book writer and a composer. And you tend, you know, those, when you look at across musical theater, you tend to see that writing partnerships stay together, at least for a few shows. You don't chop around, because once you've found a shorthand with somebody, you want to keep going with it. So there haven't been that many. You know, he had Tim Rice for Joseph, Evita, and Jesus Christ Superstar. Then even from Cats didn't really have a book writer because it's based on the T.S. Eliot poetry. And then for Phantom, he had Charles Hart and Richard Stilgoe, but that was a bit of a sort of, he kind of did it himself because it's based on a book. It's based on a novel, really bad one. But it's, you know, so it's kind of, that most, he hasn't, it just, I think to a degree, it just hasn't come up.
Yeah.
And I do think that, you know, a conversation is happening now that wasn't happening 20 years ago, which is, really, are you going to write a Cinderella with no women on the creative team? You know, are you old white guys are all going to write a Cinderella, are you? It's just, you know, and that, you know, I think that that is something that went wrong 2 shows ago with Stephen Ward, which is the story of the Profumo affair, and Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis recently, I thought, a very good BBC series that but written by a woman. You know, that story, when told from the point of view of men in their 70s who actually grew up with that in the news, and in that case it was Andrew writing the music, Don Black writing the lyrics, who's in his 80s now, and Richard Ayres, the director, also in his 80s now. And those people, you know, are trying to tell a story that is basically about, you know, what we would now recognize with no question about it as the exploitation of young girls by powerful older men. And in a kind of post Me Too and sort of post Jeffrey Epstein, Prince Andrew world, you know, there's no question about it, but there was a question about it when it literally didn't occur to them as a problem then. Yeah. But it certainly would occur to all of them now. And I think that is something that has changed. I mean, yeah. Emerald Fennell is actually the daughter of his neighbors as well. So he's known her since she was 4. But it's someone he knew. And I don't think he didn't set out he actually didn't set out to say, oh, I must find a female book writer for this. But I think he wouldn't have, you know, there's always lots of projects you could pick milling around, and you just don't pick one where your team isn't quite right. I don't think he would have done it without her. So make of that what you will.
Well, yeah, it's certainly testament to the importance of us having these conversations and continuing to have them. Like, the work doesn't stop. We have to keep, making sure that we're amplifying minority voice.
That's exactly right. Definitely.
Yeah. We wanted to just ask, do you have any input with the content that your production company produces?
Well, I mean, I certainly don't give Andrew advice on composing matters, that's for sure. I still steer well away from that. In fact, I'm much more in a learning than in a teaching position with him on that. It's, you know, very interesting to watch him at work and with the process of, you know, what makes a piece that keeps people's attention, and that, you know, you don't, music is something that you sort of, it's kind of a background. When you're watching musical theater, you don't in your mind pinpoint, oh, I like this, because you don't recognize the reasons that you're having the emotional reactions that you're having. And some of it is the lyrics, and some of it is the acting, but most of it is actually the way the score is moving you through, you know, by its time signature, by repeating phrases of music when different themes are being revisited or characters are being revisited, and stringing the emotional story together. And that is something that when you watch that, it's something that you just wouldn't ever see or know wasn't there until you'd had it pointed out to you, in cases where, like, you watch a musical that is all in 4/4 time, and you'll come out of it thinking that was a bit samey, I got a bit bored. You know, even if it's a story about a kind of really gripping story in other ways, and you won't be able to pinpoint quite why you felt like that, but the reason is because it's all in 4/4 time. So I think I'll always input from a sort of average Joe sort of way into it, in the sense that I am actually, as a 40-something female, his target demographic. The target demographic of musical theater in general is me. And so, you know, for the most part in the West End. And so I sort of, what I always try and do is just kind of go, well, you know, either, yeah, that really kind of hits home, or that's goosebumps, or yeah, you know, that's condescending, or, you know, tedious, or no, that's too many songs about train engines and I can't take another one. So,
that's really interesting. Do you feel like you have both a creative side and a business side to your job, and do you kind of enjoy that diversity?
I think that people like by separating them out. I mean, I think business is creative. I think you have to think creatively about everything that you do. And I think it's too bad when people, and in fact, the more education you have, the more likely you are to think, oh, I am this or I am that, and to separate the two things out. But the fact is, you know, the more you watch as a business person, the more you watch something, like, you know, the more musicals you see, or the more concerts you see, or the more, you know, the more Justin Bieber concerts you see, the more you kind of realize that he really needs a new stylist because he can't walk in those pants. You know, it doesn't make you a fashion designer. The more, you know, musicals you see, the more you kind of realize that, you know, the character needs to be deepened here to really have an impact, or it's too long. That's quite often the case, or the number at the top of Act 2 isn't interesting enough. You need to get the audience back into it, you know, and that sort of thing is stuff that it is the business. You know, you're in the business of creating. So you can't. I would say you can't really divide the two. And where people go wrong, I think quite often, is to say, oh no, I'm business, he's creative, because, or vice versa, because you can't, you know, the creative without a business head is just too expensive and will go bust and flop. And the business without the creative will give you something dull and, you know, badly thought through on stage. So it's all one thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we just probably sort of confine our the roles that we think of as sort of, you know, actor, producer, director, and that's kind of it. But yeah, that's really interesting. We were just wondering, do you often get asked what it's like to be a woman in business, and do you like being asked that question?
Well, so I could talk for hours on this topic, and I won't, but I guess what I would say, I was thinking about this yesterday, what I would say to you guys at your age, which is that at your age, I mean, and there were fewer women in business then than there are now. And it was very often uncomfortable. And it was, you know, you had to feel like you had your armor on the whole time. And it was just, and also, especially in the entertainment business, there's a lot of drinking, there's a lot of drug taking. I mean, you were quite often around people who were absolutely wasted and absolute assholes anyway. And it's just, you know, and so there's just, like, I can't even begin to count or enumerate the number of really rotten situations that I've seen or been in that. But you kind of, in the early days, I would sort of shrug it off, laugh it off, and you would say to yourself, you know what, they're being an idiot. I'm not gonna rise to it. I'm just gonna ignore it. And I mostly did just ignore it. But and I also would have said that when I was at AEG, the actual CEO of the company, a guy called Tim Lewicki, was a very inspiring leader. He was actually really supportive of me and very much a mentor. And I'm on the board of his new company now, and still he's very much a mentor. And you know, he made a real point of trying to bring women into management. But there came a point, though, in my career where what happened was I was chief operating officer, I was managing director of AEG Live. The actual CEO of the European company quit and went to Formula One. And I you know, it would have made the logical thing for them to do would have been to make me the CEO, which is what I'm telling this story is just it's not a sour grape story. It said, this is what happens when you hit a certain level, which is they call it the sticky ceiling, which is the board, all male, all Republican, all sitting in a room in Denver, Colorado, took the view that it was a bit, they used words like, well, you know, we really need a heavy hitter. And I was young. I mean, that is true. But we need a heavy hitter. You know, rumors started to go around that I was having an affair with this CEO, who I'd literally, you know, never been in a room on my own with. It starts to be this kind of a, why is he trying to promote her? You know, and this really nasty sort of narrative developed around me as the only woman anywhere in the management team. Things would happen like they would have an annual retreat at Mr. Anschutz's ranch in Colorado, and all of the rest of the management team, everyone else, because they were all men, would sleep in this like cowboy bunker in bunk beds. Not that I wanted to be in there, but I couldn't be in there because I was the only woman. So I would be in the house, you know, on my own, and everybody else would be out in the bunker. And you'd just be in that sort of stupid, you'd be just, that was the sort of thing that just made it very uncomfortable and hard work. But I think if you had asked me when I was 30, you know, are you being discriminated against, or are you, you know, do you feel like you're able to advance in your career as much as a man would? I probably would have said yes, and more so because, you know, I'm unique in the group, and you know, I have this strong relationship with the CEO, and you know, and you know, I don't feel discriminated against. I feel really encouraged, and I've been promoted 3 times in the last 3 years, and it's fantastic. But when it comes to the top job, that's where it stopped. And so from probably, I spent my 30s I would have answered the question in my 30s and said, no, you know, it's all been fine being a woman in this industry. You know, yes, there's some idiots, but I can handle that. But now I would say what happens is you give your, you know, you have to bring the kind of reproductive clock into the whole thing too. And what happens to women is that they work really hard, get promoted brilliantly through their 20s and 30s. You know, you work if you're a lawyer, for example, all hours that God gives, around the clock. But at the moment when everybody else is making partner or being promoted to the board, you're likely to be having children and not be having that moment at that time. I didn't. I had kids really late. But this is what happened to other women along the way. And so you're doing all the grunt work, but you're not there to get the win. And so you're out of it by the time you could be complaining about it, you know? And so I think that the message is that I think it's still really bad. I think that it's still very hard for women to get the top job when the boards are majority male. I think there's no question, the same as minorities getting on stage, people just absolutely, it's proven by study after study, they feel more comfortable with people like them, other people like them. And you have to be really pretty stroppy to push through that. And I didn't argue about it at that point. I just quit. And they put me on gardening leave for a year. And it was a great year where I didn't have to go to work. And that was it. And I only became angry about it in retrospect. But so that's the truth. And so when people ask me about being a woman in business, I give a very different answer now, which is that actually it's bloody hard work. And the hardest part is the jump to the top. And most women don't get there, are mostly obstructed at that point. And they are obstructed. There's no question.
Thank you for that transparency. And yeah, it's tricky.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the challenges that you've found of adapting your productions to an international audience, and what has to be changed apart from language?
Depends. Well, apart from language is a big thing because musicals rhyme for the most part. And so there are a lot of there's a lot of that the art of being a good translator for musicals. There are very few of them. There's maybe one per country, and it really is an art form. The same person will tend to do everything coming through because you have to keep the sense it's easier for drama than it is humor. In particular, is humor in a musical is really hard to translate. And there are great examples, like there's a line in Joseph about the brothers who don't like Joseph because the fathers, Jacob likes him best, and they say he really gets our goat. And it's funny because they're all wearing goat furs, and it's all about goats. But when you translate that into any other language, he really so he gets a huge laugh here. But when you go anywhere else and you start talking about getting goats, it just makes no sense, and you're you've lost them. So that, there's that. There's also some languages it just sounds awful. I'm sorry, but Dutch, really appalling. And some everything sounds beautiful. Everything sounds good in Russian. But so a lot of it is about the particular language. A lot of it is about the translation. China, censorship. You have to, every musical that we take through China, we have to send the whole script in to be vetted. So far we haven't managed to get anything through completely, but the stuff they change is really bizarre. And we sent in Tell Me on a Sunday, which is a one-woman show about an English girl who moves to New York and then to LA, and she's writing letters. Basically just has a series of really bad boyfriends and writes home to her mother about them. But so it was big in its day. It was part of Song and Dance, if you've ever heard of that. But anyway, it went to China, and the censors said that you couldn't have, it has this concept of a green card. This girl had got a green card to move to New York. The idea of young girls moving to America with green cards was out. So we had to change the whole thing so that it was a young girl from rural China who moved to Beijing and then Shanghai. So that was a big change. But those are the sorts of things. Certain groups of people, certain cultures just aren't interested in certain stories. You're always going to have trouble with The Sound of Music in Germany and Austria. You're always going to have trouble with Evita is problematic. You can't play it in Argentina, which is odd. All about Argentina, it's never played there once because there's this real sort of cult of personality. They practically deify Eva Peron, and our version of the story, she's quite a conniving, not particularly beatific person. So you can't do that there. Wicked just flopped horribly in China because they've never seen The Wizard of Oz. It's never played there. The whole idea of witches on broomsticks with green skin is just totally alien. They just have no idea what is going on in that show. And so, that sort of thing is highly relevant too.
What do you think the future of theatre, or the West End more specifically, will hold after coronavirus?
Well,
is there any hope?
One thing that is for fact is that you can't have theatre with social distancing in place. It's not possible. A lot of those, it's not possible economically. It's not possible on stage. I sat on a call yesterday with officials from DCMS, including a doctor working which is Department of Culture, Media and Sport, who said that theaters could reopen from July 3rd as long as people were 2 meters apart in the audience and on stage, and that the actors didn't face each other and were behind a perspex barrier so that they couldn't spit on the orchestra, and there was no singing and no woodwind instruments. The answer is, so look at people through a perspex screen. Another suggestion was, don't have the orchestra, just pipe in the music. They could be somewhere else and it could just be relayed. And you're thinking, hang on, haven't you just described television and radio? But so I think we're very far away from getting theatre back open. And I think really the government has got to start to acknowledge that not all risks are equal in order for anything to get back to normal. And at the moment, they're not. So we just have to watch and wait.
Yeah. Do you think the government will have to support the theatre in order for the West End to survive through this crisis?
I think that the truth is that theatre is not important to this government. I mean, we've been lobbying very hard. There's a lot of effort to get Premiership football back up and running. The truth is, more people go to a West End show every year than go to Premiership football. So, you know, it doesn't really stack up, but that is the perception of this government. And, you know, I think it's going to take quite a lot for them to start to understand. But it's not just theatre, it's the same issues with all live entertainment and festivals. And you know, it's a huge, first of all, it's a huge amount of money, and it's a huge amount, it's you know, 1 million jobs in this country, all of those industries and the sub industries and suppliers that rely on them. And it's, you know, part of the embedded part of the culture. And I think the government's got to understand, you know, the idea that theater is not important. I mean, where do they think the big film actors that are, you know, where does Dame Maggie Smith come from, that she's making, you know, millions for, or Judi Dench? You know, they come from the stage. They come from the stage schools onto the stage into Hollywood. They don't just pop up in Hollywood out of comprehensive schools, and that, or any schools. It's a you know, I think that there's a real lack of understanding about this, the size, the ecosystem that theater is part of through education and through theater. The idea that you can say to West End bars and hotels and restaurants, okay, you can open, but the theaters can't. They're not going to open because there are no customers. The customers are come from the theater shows. So I think that the government hasn't quite got their head around the interconnectivity of it all, and how if you let the theater industry, you know, atrophy, and this, I mean, this has happened in other places. This happened on Broadway in the 70s. You know, just theater owners went bust, and those theaters just sat there and turned into strip clubs, and the whole place became downtown. You know, that area, Times Square, was an absolute disaster area for years, until charitable organizations started buying up the theaters and getting it going again. And, you know, the government would do well to look to that and see that that's not what you want for your capital city.
Yeah, certainly. I think we'll probably move on to some questions from the audience now, because we're running out of time. That I think there are some that have already come through. Do
you want to do the first one, Ellie?
Yeah, we've got a question here that says, which asks, why was The Show Must Go On only on for 24 hours in the UK, but for 48 hours elsewhere in the world?
I think it is just when the 48 hours starts, where it starts, rather. I think all of them were 48 hours, except for Phantom was 24 hours everywhere, which is it's just a factor of all of those films are actually owned, but the rights sit with whoever distributed them originally. And so they all agreed to slightly different things.
Someone's asked how you've described how clearly it is and how difficult it is to climb to the top, and how you've tried to implement changes in your company. What advice do you have for sort of people like us at the start of our careers who want to go into the industry but have some severe obstacles ahead?
My advice is just get jobs, any jobs first, because actually theater, entertainment is a really practical business, and it is a customer service business. And in fact, if I had to look back and say, you know, was it law school, or was it Oxford University, or was it school, or what was it that really kind of that I drew on to in my career most? Actually, it was 7 years as a waitress and Tequila Slammer Girl. And, you know, that, because that is what teaches you the practicality. And when I'm hiring now, I look at CVs, including for internships and things, and I don't really look at academics. I look at what's outside of that. I look at if they ever worked in a restaurant or a bar or a shop. You know, have they been, I do look and see, you know, have you done production work? It is worth doing whatever you can at university in terms of being involved with productions and you know, doing the stuff. I mean, you look at Six, you guys from straight from Cambridge to the West End. But so do that stuff as much as you possibly can. That is important. But I think much more than there's nothing you can really do in a covering letter or in a, you just have to make yourself look practical. And that is, I would always be really nervous about hiring someone who hasn't had a job and who's just, you know, you see things, people who've just been volunteering or have, you know, done lots of activities at college, but they've never actually been in paid employment before. I always skip those, because the risk of somebody just not being able to understand a photocopier or make a cup of tea properly is too large. I think that's my advice, is get a job, get any job first, because that lots of people in theater and entertainment, because especially where you guys are at college, you know, it's not like law firms where you're going to find a lot of people who go, oh, she went to my college. I'll give her an interview, because most people have come through, you know, other routes. The ones who have come from university they're quite often that sort of social secretary route where you've booked bands in your student union or whatever. A lot of those people do go on. That's something that is a really direct route into some of the music promoting companies, if that's your line of interest.
Thank you.
We've got another question here that asks, have you ever had to work on a show or take on a project that you didn't really like artistically but was primarily motivated by money? Or does it tend to be the best shows make the most money?
Yes, I have. It's always awful. The one I mentioned before, Stephen Ward, that's the one that I really hated. I mean, it has some good tunes in it, I have to say, but it just, you know, every move of it was just made me feel slightly ill. But it didn't make any money either. So everyone, I think it got really panned. Like, look up the reviews, you'll see. But I would say, yeah, I can't think of any other dreadful ones. I mean, you see things where you think people just are, you know, charging too much for something that isn't going to be good. Like, I don't want to name names of actual shows but there's plenty that just is, you know, you can Google around and find a certain show that is heavily implying that Dolly Parton is in it, but she's not.
I think that's all we have time for, but thank you so much, Jessica, for your wonderful answers and for giving us your time. And thank you to everyone who joined the call and asked amazing questions.
Good luck, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please like our Facebook for any more updates, and register for our next Q&A with Abraham Adeyemi on Wednesday the 10th at 5:30 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.